And we're back with another episode of Apocalypsis Historia, featuring the Chance Colbert Shakespeare Authorship series. How you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing, Brady?
Doing well. It's a
happy Thanksgiving Eve
yes.
to all you folks out there. Though you guys will probably hear about this more close, maybe more like Christmas time. Hopefully not that late, but probably won't hear it tomorrow. How you folks doing? Hope everything's well with everybody. We're continuing on with our Shakespeare authorship series, though we're kind of putting a pin in the Shakespeare authorship history. We gave a pretty thorough timeline with our last 3 or 4 videos, going over exactly where the authorship question starts, where it goes public, where it sort of evolves into, all the different paths and routes that people start to take to come up with answers for why Shakespeare is not Shakespeare, and who exactly it is if it's not William Shakespeare of Stratford. And so we want to kind of move on from the history of that question and start to get to where it's at in present day, talk about where we ourselves come from, why we're talking about this, like, not exactly why it's a general question, but why are we personally interested in this question, what drew us into this, like maybe our story might inspire something in you, or maybe you might relate to it entirely differently and say, oh no, I didn't even think of it that way, this is why I'm drawn to it. I'd be very interested, for all you folks that are listening, what draws you to this question. Leave it in the comments. Drop a comment. Let us know why you're interested in the Shakespeare authorship question. Maybe you're just an orthodox person that thinks Shakespeare is Shakespeare and you just kind of want to hear what other people got to say about it. No harm in that. Welcome to the show, and you're welcome to keep listening, because I think ultimately what's really cool about the authorship question is that regardless of who you have, more knowledge comes out about the era in this search. So any of you guys that think that this authorship question's a fruitless waste of time, I don't think so. I think this is a really good way to start turning over new leaves, digging up materials that people hadn't looked at or hadn't looked at in a certain way, and we can look at them in a new light and maybe come up with new ideas and start to synthesize those new ideas with other new ideas that we find. So yeah, here, Brady, you wanna start us off?
I mean, I guess one of the to start it off, besides our names, right? So we got Brady Nash and Chance Colbert. To kind of lead it off, we're childhood friends, and I remember one of the things we used to do is like make up stories, right? And we've still been kind of like dabbling in wanting to be writers and the like, right? And we were talking prior about liking certain authors and getting hooked on books and what makes a good story, what makes a good author. And we always kind of felt a sort of due diligence, or we couldn't feel like we could be in that inner club of like good writers if we didn't spend the time trying to read some of the other writers and kind of branch out and kind of because when I think of some of this Shakespeare stuff, I think of or some of these sleeper plays that no one ever that no one really talks about or doesn't get taught in the mainstream class, right? Just some tons of cool narrative to stuff to characters to pilfer from or names or whatever, right? So that was that's where it all kind of started for me. Beginning, let alone the actual historicity and all the historiography or whatever involved with the question itself. But just like looking for cool plays, cool ideas, cool people, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, Shakespeare's kind of the standard, right? Like, how can you be a writer if you haven't not just read Shakespeare? You can't just read one play. You gotta fully embed yourself in Shakespeare.
I've definitely got fear of being a schmuck. It's just like, look at this guy. He doesn't know. He didn't quote one Shakespeare thing in this whole thing.
Like,
oh no.
I mean,
maybe it's sort of apprehensive.
Like for you folks out there that don't quite maybe understand what we're getting at, like almost every great lauded novel, every great 20th century novel, or even 19th century novel has some like Shakespeare reference, many of which are like titled after Shakespeare lines, like The Grapes of Wrath, or Brave New World, or
Grapes of Wrath is Shakespeare?
I might be misquoting, but there's plenty of them. And
Do it live.
it's not just Shakespeare. There's other titles being, references or quotes from other writers of the Shakespeare era, like For Whom the Bell Tolls, that's John Donne. But it's kind of this big thing that you use a Shakespeare line for your title. I was talking to you earlier about Robert Parker's sequel to The Big Sleep. He uses "perchance to dream."
Shout out with your name, Chance, right?
Yeah, shout out, exactly.
And then, you said the guy, just funny enough, the guy who wrote that book.
One of his Spencer novels is called Chance, and I want to say it's like number 20 in the series or something. But it's supposed to be one of his better Spencer novels, called Chance. I've got it, have not read it. And it may just be King James Bible, and not Shakespeare, but
apparently, just to interject here, Grapes of Wrath really comes from some battle hymn by Julia Howard Howe. But that in itself refers to Grapes of Wrath, refers to apparently some Revelation quote in which they say the winepress of wrath.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I misquoted there, but there's probably...
It might as well. It was tantalizing enough that I had to make sure it wasn't
better
Shakespeare.
examples that I'm blanking on.
And I've said this multiple times, or like multiple books in English. Even if it's, I was reading some book on like, Jeffrey Epstein or, pirates or anything, right? Or I was reading another one on Stephen Knight book on Jack the Ripper, and every single one even opens up with a Shakespeare quote, right? Where the Shakespeare, or I'm sorry, the Jack the Ripper one, that's all about William Gould being the main perpetrator.
Okay.
And it's got some quote, it's got some line from it, trying to be a goal catcher or whatever, right, from 12th Night or something like that. So everyone just seems to have some very succinct, little adage that they can kind of grab from it and just, sum up their entire work somehow,
And so the point being that it's like not just the standard, it's kind of this centerpiece. It's this foundation that everybody, like, hey, look at me, I'm a real writer, I'm quoting Shakespeare, and there's nothing wrong with that, 'cause Shakespeare's super powerful, and not just super powerful, it's super culturally embedded. Maybe because it's super powerful.
Does it stride the line between, not being like too pretentious,
It depends on how well done it is, because like I think sometimes you see people put Shakespeare quotes at the start of their thing, and it's like, dude, this is a business seminar. Like, what are you doing? Why do we need that? I don't know. It's like it's cleverly done in a lot of cases. Some of them you see them and it's like you start kicking yourself. Like, man, I should have come up with that. I was working at the bookstore and I forget what the book title was. It's a Romeo and Juliet quote, but apparently 2 different books had come out in the same year that were both kind of Romeo and Juliet setup stories, but they both used the same quote as the title, and they were both on the bestseller list. And it's like, wow. It's These Violent. Give me a second. I'm not a big Romeo and Juliet guy, but These Violent Delights. Thank you. So there's These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, and there's also These Violent Delights by Nika Nimarever. Both.
It's like the big line they like to use in Westworld, wasn't it?
Could be, yeah. There you go. Shakespeare's all over the place. It's like this sort of standard. So like what Brady was saying about like going and trying to get to the best of the best to, one, like boost up your writing, make your writing better, but two,
we're compelled, by the craft itself, right?
Right. Like it's this mastery, this little level of artistry, but I think beyond that, there's this like external, like cultural compulsion that I don't know if it is much for Brady. Maybe for me, it's like I have to be hoity-toity. Like I got to be able to answer questions on Jeopardy. So like. Even if I wasn't that desperately interested in Shakespeare, I just want to think that it's the type of thing that you would know to show that you're smart, so I'm going to know it to show that I'm smart, which is incredibly arrogant and pedantic and all those sorts of things. But like, that's what I thought in, like, I don't know, high school or college. Like, if you can quote Shakespeare, you are you're a sharp guy.
Well, and to give credit where credit's due, a little more of your backstory, you are actually like an English major, in and creative writing, and
so, like, yeah, I wanted to do what Brady was saying. Like, I took that to an extreme. Like, I wanted to read all these different writers, so that's why I was an English major. I wasn't maybe necessarily the greatest English student. Maybe I should have been an engineering student and made more money now. But I wanted to, like, really dive into what it took to make great literature, talk about great literature, write about great literature, and maybe I could even glean, like, how to write great literature itself if I read enough of it. And in my pursuit of an English major, I managed to get to take Shakespeare 3 times, and asterisk next to that, 'cause part of it's that I failed 2 of those Shakespeare courses. Big ol' F.
Shout out.
Some of my worst grades are in Shakespeare. But let me tell you, it's not because of my knowledge of Shakespeare. It's because they were both 9:30 classes, and pretty much across the board, my bad grades came in 9:30
Honestly,
classes.
it just means you get to say you took Shakespeare more than anybody else, right?
Yeah, I kind of got like a major in Shakespeare. But here's the thing. I didn't fail every 9:30 class that I took in college, and the ones that I did pass were because I was compelled to pass them. The ones that I did not pass were partly because I did not feel compelled to get up out of the bed and go to the class when I was maybe hungover, tired, hadn't done the work, hadn't done the reading. Why hadn't I done the reading? Did I not care? I did it for my other literature classes. Why not the Shakespeare? I personally did not like Shakespeare. I didn't get it.
Dun, dun.
Yeah, I didn't like, we read it in high school, and it's like, alright, this is kind of nifty. You get to read it aloud. You get to be thespians. Cool. But beyond that, I didn't see what the appeal was. I didn't see that it was anything that much better or even better than, like, later novels. Like, it seemed to me that the greatness of literature were in 20th century novels. Like, we should be reading, or even short stories, we should be reading Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Salinger. What are we doing wasting our time on Shakespeare? This stuff's old. It's silly. We have to get it Spark Notes translated to even understand it. What's the point? I don't get it. Beyond acting it out, I don't understand what the point is. And that was my mindset, at least as a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old kid. And so when I was taking Shakespeare at college at Southwestern University as a 19 or 20-year-old, and I had a professor, I won't say his name, when I kind of brought that sort of attitude to the class, he didn't really do much to dispel that attitude. He didn't agree with that attitude by any means, but I think he just sort of was like, oh, another kind of jock idiot that doesn't get Shakespeare. I'm not even going to bother trying to change his mind. And, maybe that's not to blame him, but I don't think he could have done much to change my mind, because everything that we talked about in that class was so universalized, and everything was so heady and abstract, and none of it felt like real life.
You feel like it's kind of like, being preached from, like, the ivory tower on down.
Absolutely. It had nothing to do with a real guy. It had nothing to do with biography or references to people. It was all these really abstract ideas and trying to write really complex literary criticisms, talking about, the nature of, femininity and love, and as you like it. And it's like, I don't know. Like, I don't really see, like, it's not a bad thing to write about. There's probably lots of folks out there that want to talk about things like that in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, but I didn't see what the big draw was. For the life of me, I couldn't. And I had another professor over at University of Houston when I transferred, and it was the same kind of Shakespeare setup, the same curriculum, same kind of syllabus. We're reading Twelfth Night, we're reading Hamlet, we're reading Macbeth, we're reading As You Like It, we're reading Lear, the good stuff for the most part. Reading Henry IV Part 1 for sure. And here's the thing, I took those classes long enough to still get Fs. Like, I didn't just drop them, like a month in. Like, I stayed with them and then just got Fs on account of too many absences. There were absence rules or regulations, and I just missed too many, not allowed to get it full credit. So the point being that I got to read all these things and got to do analysis, and I missed a lot of classes, but I didn't miss all of them. And when we'd go there, it's just kind of abstract, up in the air stuff that we weren't really allowed to talk any about historical contexts. It was almost like this stuff was crafted from like God himself. Like, it was almost biblical in that respect. That there was no real lens into the authorship, whereas like every other thing that I was interested in, like especially 20th century novels, you deeply look into who Hemingway is and what he believed in when you're talking about what he writes. You deeply look into what Steinbeck's motivations are when he's writing Of Mice and Men.
Are all of these guys quoting Shakespeare to be just pretentious like me and use a cool little one-liner, or did these guys like actually have something to say about Shakespeare, actually or whatever, right?
Right. Like, it seemed like these novelists had more to say about Shakespeare than any of these sort of literary critical essays did. It was all just kind of stuffy, blustery things that, honestly, like, no matter how good or bad they are, only other Shakespeare critics were talking about. And so it felt like this closed little circle room of people talking about stuff that wasn't important. And so I could not fully ever, at that time, get into Shakespeare, but I will say that after having read Macbeth once in high school, then once at Southwestern University, then again at University of Houston, then picking Macbeth to do my project over, I read it so many times that I started to see it myself. I was like, oh, this is why this is good. This is kind of cool. This is kind of a crazy story. And I think the big hurdle that everybody's got with Shakespeare is getting used to the language. As soon as you get used to Renaissance era language, not just Shakespeare, but all of these plays will open up to you, and you'll realize, wow, these are as good as any movies that I can watch, any comic books that I can read. The characterization, the plots, the language, the poetry of the language, the figurative devices like puns, alliteration, similes, metaphors, the structural allegories, the actual typographical layout, like it's like where form meets function sort of thing. And at some point maybe we can talk about the opening of Macbeth with the witches, that we get this pyramidal shape of their dialogue, and
while they're talking in trachaic, whatever.
And it's all based on the number threes, because there's three witches themselves, and we get the as above so below kind of stuff, and it's all incredibly like hermetic Gnostic philosophy, and it's just wild magical stuff. But it took me a long time to appreciate it. It took me basically 3 Shakespeare classes, because 2 of them were straight Shakespeare's. One was a history of British literature survey, and we did read a full Shakespeare play. We touched on a little bit of Sidney and Spenser for the Renaissance, but then we still read an entire Shakespeare play and read some sonnets, and managed to get all the way up into the Romantics. I mean, we worked from Beowulf to the Romantics and still managed to give that much time to Shakespeare. That was with Dr. John McNamara. I will give him a shout out because he's a big shot. He's one of the translators of Beowulf. If you ever get the Barnes & Noble Classics edition, it's translated by John McNamara. That was my professor. Yeah, big shot. Sorry, I'll get off that tangent here. But so for the longest time, I didn't even like Shakespeare, and then once I did finally come to like Shakespeare, it was right about when I was done with school, and between failing that class after not finishing my Macbeth project, and then reading more Shakespeare in Dr. McNamara's class, which we read Caesar, I believe, made me like, okay, this is some pretty cool stuff. Every now and then if I get bored, I'll pull it out and read a book or two. And then Hurricane Harvey hit, and I lived in Houston, Texas at the time. And I was a teacher, and we were out of school for like 2 weeks. And on like the second day of us being out of school, I said, let me pull out some Shakespeare. And so I just started reading. I must have read 5, 10, 12 plays maybe, and just tried to get this big dose of Shakespeare. And I really enjoyed a lot of them, and I was like, this stuff's kind of cool. But at the same time, some of them.
When you did that first run of Shakespeare, yeah, long that was.
Yeah, that was so that. Back then. Brady lived with me. I forget about this. Brady was my roommate at that time. We don't live together anymore, but he was, back then first getting into all the kind of Reddit posts and Reddit conspiracy stuff and kind of people posting wacky stuff. And I remember right around then I was getting really into Shakespeare, and Brady found a conspiracy thread that had somebody looking into the sonnets and doing a bunch of crazy numerology with the sonnets and showing that whoever Shakespeare was, may have known the circumference of the earth, and that you could figure it out in one of the sonnets, and you can call it the Earth Sonnet, and there's even references to the earth and size in the sonnet itself. And then similarly, you could do it with a moon sonnet and a speed sonnet with the speed of light. Wait, it's one thing, size of the earth, I think like that was maybe mathed out to some extent at that time, but like speed of light, like what? I don't even think we had kind of defined that as an idea yet. So I remember hearing that, and I was like, all right, Brady, what is this wackadoo nonsense? And he showed me, and I saw that all these things were doing stuff in miles, and I was like, guys, Brits don't use miles. That's absurd. Like, y'all are just pulling numbers out. But then I looked into it, and yeah, Brits did use miles up until the Victorian era, and so I was like, oh, okay. Well, let me look further into this, and other than the speed of light, a lot of these things would be known, especially by scientist-type, mathematician-type people, like, say, Francis Bacon or John Dee or associates of those guys, Bruno or Galileo, those type of guys. Those people would actually maybe know those numbers and know how to do those kinds of things. And maybe even speed of light they could have some guesses on by doing some experiments, and that was before stuff was like big publicized experiments, and maybe they had some behind the scenes, ways of calculating speed of light. Who knows? But at that point, it's like, what in the Sam heck is that doing in my Shakespeare? And a little bit before this, back when I was still at Southwestern University, a little movie came out by Roland Emmerich. Shout out to Roland Emmerich. Not a great filmmaker, but still shout out to him because he's too much fun. He made a movie called 2012 in 2009, which, whatever your opinion on that movie is, it's all about crazy alternate thinking on, climate change and climate disaster, and it's all about impact theory and just giant destroy the world kind of stuff. Well, right after that movie, he makes another little movie, and that's the movie we're concerned with, and that's called Anonymous, and that is the very watered down version of the Oxfordian theory. And I remember when that came out, I saw trailers for it, and it just made me so angry. Like, these conspiracy nutcases trying to ruin Shakespeare. Shakespeare's not good enough for kids, so they got to come up with some crazy alternate story to get kids interested into it. It made me so angry. Like, can't y'all just leave Shakespeare alone? You elitists, you gotta say that Shakespeare, some regular Joe, can't do it. I'm a regular Joe. You think I can't be a great writer? Curse you, darn you. And I never did see the movie. Well, I eventually did. I watched it actually very recently, and we'll go over my opinions on that maybe in another video. But thank you, sir. But that movie kind of hit a hot button for a lot of people because a lot of people did not know about the Shakespeare authorship question, and so I think a lot of people were introduced to that by that movie or just the marketing of that movie. And so like when I saw a bunch of conspiracy threads several years later, and Brady's shown me them, it's like, oh great, this is what things like that movie have done. They've just opened the gates for a bunch of nutcases to tear down my great Shakespeare. If they just go and read Shakespeare, they'd realize this is just a regular guy. But unfortunately at that time I had only read maybe a good third of the canon, and only read each of them once, other than, say, stuff like Macbeth, Hamlet, or Caesar, which I'd read several times.
He hadn't realized how cozy it was down here in the rabbit hole.
Yeah, and so later on, moved on up into Colorado, and was living up in the middle of nowhere, Colorado, and we got blizzarded in. And had nothing to do. I could not do any work. We were on a hemp farm, and I said, okay, well, I got all my other Shakespeare copies. Let me go ahead and read the rest of it.
That's when you had dipped into like some of the more comedy ones that you had.
And so yeah, I read some of the deeper cuts. Like when you read Hamlet and Macbeth and Henry IV and Caesar and Twelfth Night and stuff like that. Yeah, it's all great. It's all super lauded. It's got all the famous lines that you've already heard before you read it. But then when you get to stuff like Love's Labour's Lost, it's like, what is this? Like, you get to stuff like Merry Wives of Windsor, and you're like, what is this? You get to things like Richard III, and you're like, what is this? Oh, wow. You get to stuff like Richard II, and you're like, I like this, but this is nothing like that other Richard. and yeah, then you start to read every one of them, and Henry V's not really that much like Henry IV. Some ways it is, and some ways it's not. And it got to where, like, Brady would ask me, well, what do you think about this new one you're reading? And it'd be something like, like, what's a deeper cut comedy? Like, Comedy of Errors, or let me think, something like maybe some of the romances, like Cymbeline or something. You'd be like, what do you think about this one? Like, I literally would say, it's like they got the B team. And I didn't actually mean that there was a separate group of people. I just, like...
Or he didn't bring his A game.
Yeah, he didn't bring his A game, but, like, I wouldn't even literally say it like that. It just felt so different that I said, this feels like the B team. And that quote has kind of stuck with me, because I've since never been able to see a full unity in the plays. And then, so of course, when I got around to things like Titus Andronicus, it's like, wait a second, guys, this is clearly not even the same. This isn't even part of the same group as any of these other plays. Like, these other plays got a lot of differences, but Titus, this feels like by a whole other writer completely. So that's when I started questioning who Shakespeare was, and then I started finding people questioning it openly, and having sort of, if not fully academic, at least quasi-academic methodologies and pursuits. And I saw, the first thing I came across was the whole contingent of lawyers saying, look, Shakespeare had to have been a lawyer. And it sort of elucidated some of those plays that I was less into. Like, I wasn't really that into Measure for Measure, Merchant of Venice, or any of the so-called problem plays. It's It's like these are just kind of argumentative and really just about social outcomes, and wasn't as much about characterization. But like, as soon as I saw these people talking about, the legalities in Shakespeare, it kind of opened it up. It's like, okay, these are the sort of the legalistic, the argumentative plays where people can kind of hash something out, almost like a courtroom. And all of a sudden, they were a little more interesting. And so it's like, wait a second, this authorship question, it's not only like maybe getting at some accuracy historical answer, but it's actually like helping open up the plays, regardless of the accuracy of the authorship question. I'm now more interested in trying to fish out in some of these more problematic, or the so-called problem plays. I'm trying to fish out these social arguments that are being hashed out in the play. From there, like many Shakespeare doubter, I stumbled upon the Oxfordian theory, and
isn't that the main what Roland Emmerich's film mainly purports is?
Right. And so maybe it goes half circle 180 there, that I had been doubting this whole Shakespeare narrative for, I don't know, maybe a year or so, from like 2018 onwards, because of reading these plays and continually getting like, this feels like a different conversation, this feels like a different person, this feels like a different set of writers, and then stumbling upon all these people saying, well, Shakespeare had to be a lawyer, and then some people saying, oh, Shakespeare had to be a doctor, and then stumbling upon people like Keir Cutler that are, giving me the Mark Twain argument, like, look, we don't really quite know who Shakespeare is, and people that say they do, kind of clowns. And it's like, whoa, what is that? And from there, I did stumble upon the Oxfordians, specifically Alexander Waugh, and his videos kind of blew my mind. It's like, oh, this guy's got all the answers. And so from there on, I was kind of this growing more and more Oxfordian. And what I found particularly compelling about the Oxfordian argument was that I could all of a sudden put biographical interpretation back into Shakespeare, and that was something I was so longing to do, and it's what I found missing with my university classes, is that I want to get in the mind of the writer. At some point, who cares how accurate the theory is? At least it gives me some kind of tool to immerse myself in the mind of the writer, the mind of the protagonist. Where does the writer fit with the tone of the play? Like, where does the writer sit with the moral judgments on the other characters? Where and why does the writer, morally judge one character one way or morally judge a character another way?
And to circle it back to the very beginning, there was also the point about, we were talking about using it for like story frames, right? Because I'm talking about writing books or whatever, we'd hash out story method and story ideas, or maybe I'd go watch a movie or read some other book or whatever and be like, hey, I read this thing or whatever, and you'd be like, dude, that's straight up from like the Shakespeare thing I just read, right? So we're very much interested in like the lineage of some of these ideas that we obviously liked, right? And like what you get said, that it all kind of, maybe it's a sort of feverish obsession that we sort of have, is trying to like historiography, really place ourselves in the shoes of some of these people sometimes, right? But yeah, I think it's mostly informative, right?
Absolutely. And like you kind of touched on something there that I want to circle back to. Like I don't want to crap on my professors too much, although I liked my University of Houston Shakespeare professor more than my Southwestern University professor, because he at least brought up a good point. My mom always told me the reason why Shakespeare's so great is because he's the guy that came up with these great plots. And so, The Lion King, if any of y'all love The Lion King, well, The Lion King's plot is powerful because it's Hamlet.
More recent one is obviously The Northman, which is based on the actual Danish story, whatever,
right.
Hamlet's actually based on,
right.
Whatever.
And 10 Things I Hate About You, which was one of my mom's favorite little 90s flicks with Heath Ledger, that's based on Taming of the Shrew. And so my mom just thought, it always told me, look, Shakespeare is important because he came up with these original plots, and we're still using these plots. They're powerful plots. But some other stuff that you'd hear is that, no, Shakespeare's important because he was the best poet ever. And so he was able to put poetry into plays, and that's why he's important. Nobody else could figure that out, I guess. But then when I took a University Houston class, my professor said, look, that's not exactly why Shakespeare's important, because these plots, almost none of them are completely original to Shakespeare.
Yeah, going back to Lion King, I was like this thing where, like, Lion King, I just referenced the Danish thing, but even that story is eerily similar to the whole Egyptian Osiris Set myth, right? Where it's got the usurper uncle and you got the son, coming back to try to, redeem the whole thing and restore order or whatever. So
it's not like the creation of the plot, it's the application of the plot. Like, that's partly why Shakespeare's great is, like, yeah, he or they or whoever, she picked the plot and then applied it in this really clever way. But beyond that, yeah, like, Shakespeare's a great poet, but I don't think Shakespeare's actually the greatest just straight poet of the English language. Honestly, I don't think Shakespeare's quite the sonneteer or the lyrical ballad that, say, someone like Keats or Whitman is, like, or even some of the good moments of T.S. Eliot or Frost, like, or even some of the contemporaries of Shakespeare, like, maybe I might take Sidney's Astrophil over any of the Shakespeare sonnets, if we're just reading it for this kind of poetic story and lyrical, flowery, metrical sort of aspects. Like, I think Shakespeare's sonnets are very steeped in philosophy and may have a lot of cryptographic and geometric sort of appeal, but, like, if we're just talking about straight poetry, like, I don't know, there may be better than Shakespeare. And so, like, what is the greatness of Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare is very poetic. Shakespeare does use great plots. But what my professors really pitched was this sort of Harold Bloom argument that Shakespeare's able to get into a human psychology for all of his characters. And so, like, and not just a human psychology, an interesting human psychology for every one of his characters. Harold Bloom says that no matter what Shakespeare play, you go open it up, pick a random character, you read their lines, that's going to feel like a real person, somebody you know, or somebody that you could meet. Not just somebody, like somebody interesting, someone you would want to tell a story about. Excuse me. And so, while that's probably true, I think Harold Bloom, maybe more so than my professors, overstates that by saying, Shakespeare's the originator of human psychology and that no contemporary of Shakespeare ever reached those levels and that we still now are just barely approaching Shakespeare, yada yada, blah blah blah. I don't know that I would go that far, but I think there is something to that, and I wouldn't say it's exclusive to Shakespeare. I'd say that that's totally the case also with the great plays of Ben Jonson or the great moments of Ben Jonson. I'd say that's completely true in some of Marlowe, maybe not all of Marlowe. I don't think that is necessarily true of Tamburlaine. But that's totally true of Jew of Malta. Like, Barabbas is, like, one of the best and most realized characters in any of these plays. So, I do think that my professor was making a good point with that. But the whole reason I bring it up is that, yeah, like, it goes back to our original question. Like, yeah, okay, Shakespeare's the standard. Why is he the standard? What's so great about him? Or them, or they, or she, or he, or, whoever Shakespeare be. I honestly just would say that, yeah, it's a combination of so many things. Shakespeare can structure plots. Shakespeare can make great super depth of character and give dynamics to that character and show character arc and have
words.
Multiple characters arc over a play and their arcs intertwine and foil with each other, and all the while those characters all saying things with philosophical import and poetic flourish, like it's, and then having statements about politics and society and family and love, and it's all there. It's all really great. But going back to the my sort of history, going into the Oxfordian theory, it was great. It opened a door for me to take these abstracts and sort of give a psychology to those abstracts. Ironically, Shakespeare's the greatest, writer of human psychology, but we don't have a human psychology for Shakespeare. The orthodox narrative cannot give a psychology to the Stratford man. We don't have enough documentation to do that. And beyond the lack of documentation, we have so many things that are beyond our sort of explication for how Stratford would have those experiences, like travel to Italy, or falconry, or medical knowledge, or legal knowledge, or, like we're saying, Masonic and Hermetic knowledge. Like, I don't think Stratford was a member of the Masons. How does he know how, Masonic meetings would go?
Not to mention, like, all that history, convenes or starts all with it's all Francis Bacon stuff, and that's all those guys. It's like what all
the Rosicrucians.
They're all starting the Rosicrucian stuff and all, or
And then beyond that stuff like family histories that all pop up in the history plays, like the Earl of Oxford, his great whatever is actually a character in Richard III. He's one of the ones that's with Henry VII that comes in and saves everybody in the end. There's actually some connection there. Similarly, that Henry Neville's related to several of the characters in several of the history plays. William Stanley's related to several of the characters in the history plays. Other characters or other people like Henry Percy related to several of the characters in the history plays. And so, at some point, at least pitching an alternative candidate lets us build a psychology around this writer and maybe gives us some kind of overlaying structure for us to sort of conjecture a psychology for, okay, how would a writer try and do this with these life experiences? Because at least we know these people had these life experiences, and we can understand how they would have these life experiences. We can't do that with a Stratford man. So at some point, it's not very helpful and to try and say, oh, he's just some guy that had a really great imagination. Like, I like to think I'm a creative guy and I'm an imaginative guy, but I can't think of things from scratch. I need to have experience with them. And there's actually like a school of thought that builds up around this in the 16 and 1700s, and it's called divine inspiration. People like Shakespeare did what they did through a technique called divine inspiration, almost like they'd meditate until like just the genius came into them, like they were a conduit or something, and then they wrote it down, because there's no other way to explicate how the guy knows all the Latin and Greek, how the guy knows where stuff is in Italy, how the guy knows how all these courtly interactions and proceedings would be happening. He just has to imagine it, and it was pretty spot on, because he's, divinely inspired. This wasn't just, mundane inspiration. This is divine inspiration.
I gotta give me some of that divine inspiration. Yeah, I'm wasting all this time reading these history books, man.
Right, it's, that was literally a lot of people, that was how it happened, and so you just knew someone was great by how much divine inspiration they had.
I'm sorry, there's too many stoner weed jokes I like.
right, hold on.
Shakespeare, I'm divinely inspired.
Hold on, I gotta go touch divinity real quick, yeah, man. Exactly. Let me get inspired, man.
So it's very apt for
get some fire to get inspired. Yeah,
right for means.
Exactly. That was sort of eventually torn down, and it was torn down because that had to be built up because everybody agreed Shakespeare didn't go to school for long enough to know all this stuff. It was pretty much agreed. Okay, so I'm lying. That wasn't totally agreed. There were two schools of thought. There was Shakespeare didn't actually know that much Latin or Greek or have that much classical learning, and the other school that said he did, said he did despite not having gone to school long enough to know that stuff. That he just had to be divinely inspired, along with maybe a little bit of resource and elbow grease. But eventually, that school of thought kind of won out because the other school of thought was that Shakespeare wasn't learned, and you read that stuff enough, you realize, okay, whoever's writing this does know their stuff. And so that divine inspiration theory kind of won out, but then that sort of eventually lost steam to the newer school of thought, and this is still kind of the widely held belief, is that, no, Shakespeare did go to school long enough to learn that stuff, and that their Latin schools and grammar schools in the middle of nowhere Stratford would have totally been good enough for someone like Shakespeare to know what he did and write what he wrote. I find that a little hard to swallow, but that's still pretty much widely agreed to be the case these days. But at least they're not saying divine inspiration. At least it's not like he's just touched by the hand of God. But it is still kind of not a good answer. It doesn't really do much to say some 13-year-old could have all the knowledge of classical learning to write Shakespeare. That's kind of absurd to me.
Yeah, any other historical figure that's got any sort of experience with learning extra languages. There's just so much of a paper trail of them doing it. It's like, oh, I just don't know why it came to mind, but I think of Alexander Hamilton for some reason. I read some book, and just lots of accounts of him voraciously reading or whatever, writing.
Right.
I think a lot of
and he's supposed to be another one of these middle class kids that comes up into greatness, which asterisk next to that, but still, at least with him we do get documentation of him and all those things and who he was. This Shakespeare guy, almost all the documentation on him is pretty scant. None of it's his own personal letters. Most of it's from around the year 1611 and 1612, which I find a little suspect. It's pretty late in his career, and it's pretty much right around when he's supposed to stop writing. So I don't know why that is when we get all the corroborating evidence of him. It's his late career when he dies. But I was an Oxfordian because of this biographical interpretation power. People like Hank Whittemore, check out his blog. It's pretty awesome. He will tell you 100 reasons why Oxford was Shakespeare, and a lot of them are saying, look, this is what we know what happened in Oxford's life. This is what happens in the plays. You do the math. And a lot of times the math seems like, oh, shoot, I don't see why he wouldn't be the guy. And there's a lot of other stuff, and I won't go into the whole Oxfordian theory, but it's really compelling. And I was an Oxfordian for a good 2-3 years there, from 2018 on into 2020, 2021, into the COVID years. I was just watching Alexander Waugh, reading Whittemore's blog, watching and reading people like Hopkins Hughes or Strittematter, or and dabbling with other people like Ross Barber, just really trying to get into this SAC sort of scene, Shakespeare authorship question scene. But ultimately, you'll notice that I'm not sitting here preaching an entirely Oxfordian theory. So what caused the shift? And I think what it was a combination of being introduced to other theories. Came across the Thomas North stuff, and it's whoa, that Thomas North stuff's kind of crazy. It's kind of compelling, and I can see why someone like Dennis McCarthy would go so far as to say, no, this is Shakespeare. Thomas North is Shakespeare. Came across some of the Baconian stuff, specifically Peter Moonson, and if you haven't checked out the Cracking the Shakespeare Code timeline documentary, go check that out. That'll blow your socks off. And coupled with that is all the Nevillian stuff that's been coming out. and that's sort of corroborated by that documentary. And then at some point, I was like, all right, let me go and do some of the original research myself. Let me see what some of these old hats say about Shakespeare. Because I'm getting a lot of people saying a lot of stuff. I was pretty much set with Oxford, but then I saw Munson's documentary, and it's like, wait, what? Bacon's all over this stuff. How can we have this much Bacon if it's just 100% Oxford? Like, Alexander Wall will tell you that he can go dig up the floor of Westminster Abbey and find Oxford's body there under the statue of Shakespeare. Like, shouldn't that be enough? Well, Peter Amundsen can tell you that he can find a treasure map in the folio and go dig up the Oak Island treasure, which people already knew was a treasure, but he found that independently in the folio of Shakespeare. And that History Channel documentary, it's a continue running show. It's like Oak Island or something, where guys are constantly digging it up. That was partly compelled to happen because of Peter Amundsen's research. Wall seems like he's got all the answers, but this other guy seems like he's got all the answers too. And at some point, I kind of need them to corroborate and talk with each other and say, your stuff's in here too, or your stuff's not in here, and you're wrong for this reason. And because of that, I started saying, okay, look, maybe we have a group theory. And I forget her name, Sabrina Feldman, maybe? She's a Thomas Sackville scholar, and she was pitching Thomas Sackville at one of the recent SAC conferences, and she kind of at the end qualified her whole thing by saying, I don't think Sackville's the main guy, like maybe he's barely even in it, but he's part of this scene, and he himself was a concealed poet playwright likely in the 70s and 80s, and so there's at least a pattern for other people doing this. And at some point, is it possible that we have a group or collaborative effort? And that, coupled with seeing the Bacon evidence in conflict with the Oxford evidence, or maybe not even in conflict, but in complement with each other, made me start thinking, wait, do we have a group theory? And so I started reading older authors like Stotzenberg, Robert Fraser, G.G. Greenwood, R.C. Churchill, to see what do we have here? What are our options? Just lay it out all on the table. I thought it was just one guy. It was just Oxford, and they had me pretty convinced, despite my lack of unity. There was maybe answers for that. Different time periods writing it, different maybe editing hands like Ben Jonson or Francis Bacon, editing Oxford stuff and slightly changing it. Maybe that could answer the disunity in the canon. But at some point, it's I have someone here saying that Bacon wrote everything. I have someone here saying Oxford wrote everything. I have these other old hats that are saying all sorts of wild stuff. And so, for any people that are just now getting into this conversation or into this discussion, or maybe not just getting into it, but you've only been in it for a year or two, you've likely only heard a few alternative answers, and you've probably only heard Stratford's the guy, or Oxford's the guy.
Or Marlowe.
Maybe you've heard sorry, shout out to you Marlovians out there. I have not mentioned much of Marlowe. You've probably heard Marlowe wrote it, and you are either convinced by that argument or not, and then you come across the Oxfordian or Baconian argument, and generally speaking, you pick from the three. It's almost like we're in the Protestant Reformation. You're Anglican, Catholic, or Protestant or Puritan. You pick one. But I would like to present maybe sort of an agnostic alternative to totally wedding yourself to a singular theory. And we've had this infographic up this entire video, so maybe we can talk about it now. So these are my way of graphically showing someone's theory. It's a model of someone's theory. And so this top left one we got here, it's an Oxfordian theory, specifically Alexander Wall. I figured start with him since he's the one that started leading me down this rabbit hole. So his theory is that Edward de Vere is the real writer of Shakespeare, but but Edward de Vere did not begin with the Shakespeare pen name. He likely wrote under his own name early on in the 70s or 80s, and then for whatever reason started writing under the names Robert Greene, maybe also writing under the name Thomas Nash, maybe others as well. But not only that, he's likely leading a scriptorum of other writers. And so there are other writers who are getting vast amounts of influence from de Vere, guys like John Lilly, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, Anthony Munday. And so Alexander's big argument for why de Vere is Shakespeare and Stratford's not Shakespeare is like, look, de Vere is totally surrounded by all these guys. He is at the center of all of it. He's missing all of his works. We have all of Shakespeare's works. Maybe the two are the same. And it's a pretty compelling theory. But then we get other theories, like Donna Murphy, who's one of my favorite Marlovians. She's like, look, there's so much in Marlowe that we can connect to Shakespeare. There's so many parallel passages that we can connect. And she's one of the inventors of the Marlowe-Shakespeare continuum. She says, look, because a lot of people say, look, we can take Marlowe's works and compare it to Shakespeare's, and we can say they don't match up. But she says, well, no, they don't perfectly match up in like one big group. What they give you is a continuum, a line. And so by date, the earliest Marlowe stuff's the most Marlowe-y stuff, and the latest Shakespeare stuff's the most Shakespeare-y stuff. And by time, you can kind of go on a straight line down the road. And so she says, look, Marlowe's the one that's writing Shakespeare. But she goes a step further and she says, look, but Marlowe's not the only one writing Marlowe. Thomas Nash is actually co-writing with Marlowe, and then at some point Thomas Nash becomes Thomas Dekker, and the two of those are writing the works of Marlowe and then go on to write the works of Shakespeare. And she concedes that there may be more pens as well, but those are the two main ones. And so she says, look, Marlowe and Thomas Nash are Shakespeare. And then I wanted to include some of these YouTube channels to give them a shout out. So after watching this video, you should check out some of these channels that we got listed here, like Alexander Waugh, or shout out to Jonah Freeman. He's an Australian. He's a big Baconian fan, and he's got some really great YouTube content. Like, his videos are really good. He's a thespian himself. He's a kind of big shot actor, and I hope I'm not mistaken. I think he's Australian. He may be from New Zealand. If so, excuse my American ignorance. But yeah, check out his channel. He is wild, he's wacky, but he's super sharp guy, and he knows his theater. And so he is a huge Bacon fan, and he'll tell you, look, Bacon's the super genius behind Shakespeare, but he's not just the super genius behind Shakespeare. He's doing most of the university wit stuff. He's the guy writing Marlowe. He's the guy writing Nash. He's the guy writing Greene. So he's Dr. Faustus, he's the guy. And he's the uber genius. And it's compelling because Francis Bacon's a freaking smart dude. Go read Ben Jonson's words on Shakespeare, and then go read Ben Jonson's words on Bacon. One guy's way more impressive than the other to Ben Jonson. Like, Ben Jonson say, yeah, Shakespeare is good, but then he'll like qualify those statements. But when he talks about Bacon, boy howdy. So let me move on here. Come back to the Florians over here. I'm going to start over here. Shout out to Bastion Conrad. I know he's been watching some of our videos. He's been commenting. Thank you so much, Bastion, for doing that. I hope you're continuing to put out content on your channel. You guys need to go check out Bastion. He's got loads of content. He is a big Marlovian. He's very similar to Jonah Freeman, actually. But unlike Jonah, who thinks Bacon's Marlowe, Bastion thinks that Marlowe is the supreme genius, and that Bacon, while being a sharp dude, is not really anything compared to Marlowe's genius. And he's a buddy and associate of Marlowe, but Marlowe is the secret genius that needs to be hid away for political reasons. Is likely living out his life mostly in Italy. He's going under bunch of pseudonyms. So like, here's where some of you guys might really like Bastion. Here's where some of you guys might get lost with Bastion. Bastion will tell you Marlowe wrote not just Shakespeare, but pretty much everything. Like Marlowe wrote the sonnets of Barnaby Barnes, or Marlowe wrote the works of Michael Drayton, or that Marlowe wrote the works of Thomas Dekker, or that Marlowe wrote the works of Thomas Middleton, or that Marlowe wrote the works of Thomas Heywood, or Marlowe wrote the works of, name it, just name it. That's what he thinks. And maybe it's not completely impossible. Like, if a guy has nothing else to do and he's just stuck in some like little flat outside of Rome or something near the Vatican, and all he can do is just sit there and write and just send it off to messengers till he gets the next letter saying what he needs to write next. It's maybe possible. Moving onwards, here's Dennis McCarthy. Mentioned him a second ago. So he says, look, we got a bunch of evidence that Thomas North is one of the main sources of Shakespeare, and that's, agreed upon by Orthodox scholars, that Thomas North's translations of Plutarch and Prince of Dial and other things like that are one of the main sources for a lot of the plays of Shakespeare. In fact, wholesale passages and lines being taken from Sir Thomas North, and in a lot of cases, like, not even wholesale lines, but wholesale passages, but the lines being sort of reworked or re-edited. And so Dennis McCarthy argues, look, that means North is the guy, but he's putting him out through the front man Stratford, and that's what's making the works of Shakespeare. And then mentioned Peter Amundsen as well. So he'll tell you Bacon's the super genius, but it's not just Bacon. He's got his buddy, aka his cousin, aka his nephew, actually, Henry Neville, even though they're basically the same age. Henry Neville and Francis Bacon are writing most of the works of Shakespeare. If not all the works of Shakespeare. We may get edits by other people, maybe like by Ben Jonson, maybe even by the typographers, Eld and Thorpe and that crowd. But they're doing all the works of Shakespeare, not just Shakespeare, but most of your university wits and maybe even a lot of your Henslow crowd. Maybe even Ben Jonson as well, maybe not being Ben Jonson himself, but being part of Ben Jonson's writings. And then shout out to the John Florio YouTube channel. It is hosted, I don't know her name, I need to get to know her name, but she's an Italian lady, and she is a big fan of John Florio, and I really enjoy her channel because she's not here to tell you that John Florio is the uber single genius. No shade to Jonah, or no shade to Bastian, but she will concede that, look, there's got to be other people in this. One guy can't do everything. Like, John Florio's works himself is a whole lifetime of work, much less the work of Shakespeare and many other playwrights and poets. So she says that John Florio is maybe one of the main writers or thinkers, but he's doing it in collaboration and concert with other people to make the works of Shakespeare and other playwrights. Moving onwards, here's one of my favorites, Stephanie Hopkins Hughes. She's an Oxfordian. She's got kind of this one-to-one theory. She says, look, I think Edward de Vere is Shakespeare, and probably also Robert Greene before Shakespeare, but there are many other people that we got to talk about. Like, Thomas Dekker is maybe as good a writer as Shakespeare. John Webster is maybe as good a writer as Shakespeare. We need to talk about them, and in order to talk about them, we need to know who they are. And guess what? Same conflicts we got with Shakespeare, we can totally say that about John Webster. We can totally say that about Thomas Dekker. We can totally say that about many other authors. We don't know who they are. We have names and university lists. We have birth certificates. That's it. We don't have letters from these people. We don't have full understandings. We've sort of built and constructed understandings, but those may be totally fictitious. And so she believes that, like, look, what are the odds that just Edward de Vere's doing this and nobody else? There's got to be other people doing it, and she's pretty darn convinced that Francis Bacon's totally doing it. Just like maybe, say, Jonah Freeman or other people, but unlike Jonah Freeman, she doesn't think that Bacon is writing Shakespeare. She thinks Bacon's writing Dekker, who may be as important or more important than Shakespeare for his era. She thinks that Sidney's writing John Webster.
And so she thinks that you can do this for other people, and you can kind of one-to-one their names till we've gotten every unknown writer of the era listed out. And yeah, maybe in some cases people have multiple pen names, but for the most part we should be able to one-to-one it out, which I find pretty compelling, but maybe a little too simple. And then I put in some older theories here, like Robert Fraser, get some Derbyite stuff on here. Because even though there's maybe not a big Derbyite contingent, you can still find some blogs on the internet saying, I think William Stanley is Shakespeare. So even though we don't have maybe a big contingent of YouTube channels or papers coming out on academia, there are people out there. Shout out to you guys. So Robert Fraser says, look, William Stanley's writing a lot of plays that we find in Shakespeare, but not all of them. Some of them are actually old stock plays, but the writings of William Stanley and these random stock plays are all being stolen and compiled by Stratford and then given to Hemmings and Condell, and that's where we get the works of Shakespeare. So kind of like McCarthy's, we got to get it through Stratford. We got to get it through Stratford. And so that's sort of a common thing that you'll see in some theories. I don't know how much I'm interested in it, but at some point I will have to explicate what Stratford's role is. And then Stotzenberg, he's probably my favorite of all of them. He actually is a little more nuanced in his theory. Every other theory so far we've seen is just like this guy or these people are Shakespeare. And so Stotzenberg says, well, what is Shakespeare? Because we have several things. We got the folio with all the plays. We got the sonnets that are, the 100-something sonnets, which are each just 16-line poems. And then we got 2 giant epic poems. And he doesn't take it on face value that these are all being written by the same people. And so Stotzenberg says, look, I'm going to look at this first and I'm going to say who I think it is. And so he does. And he says, this is clearly Bacon. There's so many lines that we can trace back to Bacon's journals, mirrors Bacon's philosophy and scientific thought. And so he goes forward and he starts reading the sonnets and he says, look, these don't really make much sense if they're by Bacon. These don't really feel like Bacon. These feel much more like a random name that people hadn't considered. Philip Sidney. The original sonnets here with Astrophil and Estella. But how can that be? Philip Sidney's supposed to be dead. Well, these sonnets must have been written a while ago and then printed later. Kind of like Astrophil and Estella was. Most of Sidney's writings were not printed until long after he was dead. At least 5-6 years till after he was dead, if not later. So probably same thing's happening. But then he goes further and he starts reading all the plays and he says, look, there may be some stuff by Bacon in here, but I'm not getting heavy doses of Bacon. This doesn't feel like the same as this. Maybe some parts, but not the whole. It definitely can't be Sidney. He's supposed to be dead, so not even going to begin to ask that. And he actually says the same thing about Marlowe. He says, look, I think Marlowe and Sidney could totally be some of the guys writing this, but they're supposed to be dead, so I'm not even going to consider it. Which, that's something that Brady and I will go back on, and we will consider Sidney and Marlowe for being in the folio, because I'm not going to take it on face value that these guys are dead. We'll come to that later. And so Stotzenberg says, look, I can actually trace a bunch of lines from Dekker and find them in Shakespeare. I can trace a bunch of lines from Drayton and find them in Shakespeare. I can trace a bunch of lines from Chettle, find them in Shakespeare. I can trace a bunch of lines from Heywood, find it in Shakespeare. And so he thinks that these guys are part of Henslow's group and that they're writing the works for Henslow, and that a lot of those are getting repackaged and reworked by Francis Bacon and Ben Jonson, and they're getting later printed and compiled under the Shakespeare name for marketing purposes. And so what I wanted to point out... Oh, sorry guys, spoiler there. What I wanted to point out here is that we have all these theories here. These are just several random theories. We could have picked other ones and they'd look a little different, but all of them pretty much, they're all a little different, but they all kind of look the same. They got a few boxes, a few arrows. We think this guy's this guy, boom, Shakespeare. Think this guy's this guy, boom, Shakespeare. Boom, Shakespeare. I don't know that any of these are sophisticated enough to actually accurately answer not just the Shakespeare authorship question, but the expanded authorship question. Some of these might explicate who Marlowe is. They might explicate who Shakespeare is. But very few of these explicate who everybody is. And, shout out to Bastian Conrad for doing that. But none of these are able to answer who everybody is and do it in a parsimonious way. No shade to you there, Bastian, but just one arrow for every writer is kind of hard to explicate. There needs to be a more sophisticated theory for the Shakespeare authorship question out there. All of these are really, really simple models that are only going to answer a few questions, and honestly, every one of these will fail with enough questions. I don't know why in the world Christopher Marlowe would be dedicating the folio to Mary Sidney's kids. What in the world would Christopher Marlowe want to... And so, that's not going to be explicated here. Dennis McCarthy's shown all the Thomas North lines that are in Shakespeare, but same question. Why in the world would Thomas North's works be dedicated to Mary Sidney's kids? And I don't have a Pembroke theory on here, but if I had a Pembroke Mary Sidney's Shakespeare question on here, I can't answer why Mary Sidney would know all these legalistic and medical knowledge. She is a woman. She could not be part of an inn. She could not be part of the Royal Society or the Proto-Royal Society. So how does she have all this knowledge? At some point, she could get it from, say, her brothers or her friends or her husband. But then I'm still using her as a conduit through other people, and I need to sort of explicate that out. And so, not one of these, I think, can hold up to every question. You can use some of these to identify people. I can use Waugh to identify De Vere in Shakespeare, but I cannot use it to conclusively prove De Vere is all of Shakespeare. I can use Donna Murphy to identify Nash and Marlowe in Shakespeare, but I cannot use it to conclusively prove that they are all of Shakespeare. And so at some point, we need to at least attempt to do that. And so here is our theory. You'll notice it's a little more going on. I can't even get it into full view. This is crazy. There we go. Here's one more time. Here's our theory. So, going along with Stephanie Hopkins Hughes, sort of one-to-one, there probably is some semblance of that. But beyond just the one-to-one, I think that there's plenty of iterations of combinations of people. So I think the works of Marlowe are not just by one guy. The works of Marlowe are by several people, which would include Thomas Nash, Robert Greene, George Peele, Christopher Marlowe, maybe even Edmund Spenser. Are those people all those real people, or is it perhaps the case that someone like, say, Francis Bacon is actually Thomas Nash? And of course we know Thomas Nash is actually Thomas Dekker through Donna Murphy, and so Francis Bacon is Thomas Dekker, as Stephanie Hopkins Hughes says. But in that case, who the heck is Chapman? Well, Chapman must be the Edward de Vere, who would have originally been Lily and also one of the writers of Marlowe, and then later used the pen name Chapman. I got question marks next to all these because these are all just kind of plug and play. We could have a million iterations, and so I put in blue a different set of alternate options, but we could have a set in red, we could have a set in orange. Do the math, we could have a bunch of different permutations and combinations of these names. And so we need to do a lot of internal evidence and look at a lot of external evidence to try and logic out who must each of these be. And it may be the case that some of these people are not fake people. So it could be that Henry Chettle is just a dude named Henry Chettle, and we may not be able to place Anthony Bacon or Henry Neville as Henry Chettle. So that will be difficult to figure out as well, but that's how difficult this question is. Anybody that's not looking at this question with this full lens is honestly not taking this fully seriously. So no shade to Alexander Waugh or Bastian Conrad or Ross Barber, but they're really only looking at one little lens, one little speck in this whole conversation. And I think Waugh's done an excellent job showing that Edward de Vere is in Shakespeare, is maybe the main writer of Shakespeare, but he has not done any sort of thing to prove that he is 100% all of Shakespeare, and that Bacon cannot be part of it, or that Henry Neville cannot be part of it. And many of the things that he uses to prove de Vere is part of it are the same exact things that people like Peter Amundsen are using to show that Bacon and Neville are in it. And so, at some point, I need them to acknowledge that, and to continue to just say de Vere's our guy seems a little disingenuous, if not naive, if not, I don't know, like cynical. Like I kind of need them to acknowledge that there's a wider discussion here at hand.
I feel like sometimes they're apprehensive also about, because how many of those guys, like, he'll say de Vere or whoever wrote it, but then, like you're saying too, or didn't both of these guys like all grow up in the Cecil household together a lot of the times, right? So even if like you only want to give spotlight to one dude, it's like the other two guys that were other people are pointing fingers at, they're right next to him, like literally they grew up together,
right?
So
right.
Does that not not to toot our own horn, but I feel like that kind of gives a little more weight to a group theory if you're taking this aristocrat.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Like it's not like we just have some random conglomeration of different people, and it's like I've got my guy A versus your guy B. It's like, well, guy A and guy B happen to be cousins, or guy A and guy B happen to be like brother-in-law. So like, how different are your theories? How separate are they?
Yeah.
And like Francis Bacon and Edward de Vere both spent tons of time growing up at the Cecil household. Like de Vere's 10 years older than Bacon, but like tomorrow's Thanksgiving. You go to your extended family for Thanksgiving. The Cecil household's kind of maybe one of these kinds of gathering places that people like Bacon and de Vere would be meeting for things like Thanksgiving or their version of it. I don't think they had Thanksgiving. That's Abraham Lincoln helped institute that in America. That's a very American thing. But the point being that these are not isolated theories. So like, why don't we connect these theories more? Why are they so isolated? And so one of the big complaints from the alternative side of things is that the orthodox scholars get completely tunnel visioned, and they get where they will defend their theory to the teeth because their job is at stake, their notoriety, their reputation. They want energy, time, and money being put onto their theory, and if something undercuts that theory, time, money, and energy is going to go away from that. Well, I think at some point we have Alexander Waugh not talking about Bacon for that very same reason. We have Baconians not wanting to bring up Oxford for those very same reasons. And instead of them trying to work out what the actual relationship is between them, it turns into a contest of why my guy's a better candidate than yours. And at this point, I'm all for the idea that both are very clearly in the canon, so let's just kind of explicate who's doing what. But we haven't gotten that far yet. And so that is where we're trying to come from, and it's not just Bacon or Neville or de Vere. Like, there's a lot of folks. Like, Bacon's got a brother Anthony that works with de Vere, and there's this other lady, Mary Sidney, whose brother Philip was maybe the best writer ever, and this guy Philip may or may not be dead. And there's this guy William Stanley, who is the son-in-law of Edward de Vere. And by the way, Mary Sidney's son would become the son-in-law of Edward de Vere. And Robert Devereux, who is the Earl of Essex, was the, maybe childhood lover of Mary Sidney, whose sister is the lover of Philip Sidney. And so we have a lot of family connections. Roger Manners is the son-in-law to Philip Sidney. William Herbert, there we go, son of Mary Sidney.
That's when you have, but then it's when you have some of the people go, well, what about Marlowe? What about Marlowe? And that's when we have to go, oh, well.
And so that's where my theory, or our theory, might be a little elitist. Just a heads up. We only have so far right now. These are all
I mean, you already have a lot of people already suggesting, Don Murphy saying that, Nash's Decker is Marlowe, right? So
Right.
already people are starting, they're fine with assuming some of these are pseudonames or pen names or
Right.
whatever, right?
We're just going kind of to the extreme, at least for the initial time being, trying to suggest only people that we know are real. And like at this point, aristocrat noble types are really the only people that we can find good enough documentation to say we know they're real. Does that mean we have to assume everybody else is fake? No. But we're going to maybe start with assuming a lot of them are fake and see if that helps or doesn't help. And like, here's the thing, is that like we have a bunch of names, but there's plenty of other names that these people were all known to be concealed poets or very connected with poetry and playwriting. And then there's other like playwrights. Like I got a bunch of playwrights listed out here, but there's other ones that like are big shot, awesome playwrights writing stuff to the level of Shakespeare and others. Like, and we kind of want to ask, like, is it possible if any of these other ones are pseudonyms? And so it may be that several of these people are not pseudonyms and that they're university educated middle class kids that get to come up and get to be around these super learned people, get access to libraries and get access to travel or get to talk with people that traveled. And it could be totally possible that some of these are middle class inn kids like John Marston or Thomas Middleton or even John Webster. But we're going to, for the sake of equality, we're going to assume it's the same as Shakespeare. And so I don't know why I would say all these people are fake, but Chris Marlowe, real dude. I don't quite understand how I can connect him to these people other than through his patronage, but that's the same issue we have with Shakespeare. I'm not going to connect Shakespeare to Henry Wriothesley because of his patronage. I'm not going to connect Marlowe to Thomas Walsingham because of his patronage. That doesn't show me that he's a real guy. That just shows me that Thomas Walsingham may have had influence or say over what was written. Just shows me that Thomas Walsingham's connected to these writings, but that doesn't show me that Marlowe's a real dude. Henry Wriothesley is connected to the Venus and Adonis poem, but that doesn't show me that Shakespeare's a real guy. So there are biographical documents for Marlowe that there are not for Shakespeare, and we'll do that in another video. But for the time being, the point is that we have a lot of noble types that were supposed to be concealed poets. Almost all of these have really close connections with Secret Service, Francis Walsingham specifically. Francis Walsingham is the head of the Secret Service. His daughter was married to Philip Sidney, and when he died, or supposedly died, she married Robert Devereux. So two of these people are the son-in-laws of Francis Walsingham. Anthony Bacon is supposed to have worked for Francis Walsingham. So is Henry and Francis. Edward de Vere's cousins worked for Francis Walsingham. And it's possible that other folks on this list have super direct connections to Francis Walsingham as well. And so not only do we have concealed poets and learned folks that are very literary, but we also have folks that are all wrapped up in state espionage. And so it seems completely possible to me that these are the people that are using pen names. Like, if you're ever going to use a pen name, you need those kinds of means and opportunities to do it. And we have a perfect explication for it. We have Francis Walsingham. We have the Secret Service. We have William Cecil, the Secretary of State, basically the Prime Minister of the time. They don't actually have Prime Ministers, but that's essentially what they functioned like. And like, those are the two most powerful dudes of their time, and they're completely super directly, they're family with these people. So we're going to go with that as the basis of our theory, rather than arbitrarily say it's one guy because he's really smart. We would like to say that it's through actual economic governmental means that these things are happening.
Sort of a weird, not quite. We don't want to quite say it's a post-colonial analysis of the Shakespeare authorship question, but
you could take it in that direction.
But we're very much, we were bringing up all these sort of espionage, state secrets, sort of state operation.
Yeah, like we're definitely coming from the Frankfurt School. Like this is definitely some anti-top-down stuff. Like we think that Shakespeare, this whole Shakespeare project, if you will, is a very top-down oriented.
Not
project.
Organic, not by one dude, but a very curated thing. Project.
And this sort of family or circle of people could maybe help explicate that and be the foundation for this theory. Whereas, no offense to these theories because they're all super helpful, but like they don't, for the most part, give much explication for how that would work. Peter Moonson will tell you it's the Rosicrucian stuff, and the John Florio channel kind of leans towards that kind of stuff as well. But that just turns into the sort of ethereal, behind the curtain thing that we can't explicate. The Rosicrucians, the Masons, they did it. We don't know how.
Sort of those apologetic. Oh, they're slowly disseminating knowledge to the masses.
Yeah, and then on top of it, like
enlightening the people, or you get a lot of those angles. It's sort of the Delia Bacon angle we kind of talked about.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and we're very much.
If anything, you're kind of re-pedestalizing Shakespeare again. Oh, they must be divinely inspired. It's,
right.
Wait,
that they're doing this for our betterment, and we're so much better off because of them. Like shout out to the writers of all this stuff. They've written some good stuff, but I'm not gonna say that their vision of the world is why we have what we have. Like that, even if that is true, I don't want to give them that credit, right? So I guess we can maybe wrap it up around here. I think that brings us full circle exactly what our paths were, why we've come to where we're at, where some of these modern theories are at, and really bringing it back to this idea that we need a more sophisticated model for this theory. Like, how are we ever supposed to explicate all these names, explicate this entire scene, or explicate just even the pseudonymity? Explicate even the pseudonymity and the secrecy behind the Shakespeare proceedings. Like, if Edward de Vere is Shakespeare, how is he getting to write in secret and publish it under a different name?
And still the question of why, I guess, we haven't really nailed down, because I feel like that's such a big question for people, is why bother covering up your name? Why bother giving it a pen name? Why wouldn't you want all the glory of, or whatever, right? And I feel like that is a very big concept to try to get around, right? Maybe it's to try to sell the idea to people that, look, you could go be a writer too. Look, this one guy did it, like you were trying to talk about earlier, right? Sell this sort of narrative about the rugged individual, or the potential, right? Or is it to hide maybe sort of state secret idea? Maybe they don't, people are not really going to pick it up. It's like, oh, look, the royal aristocrat, bureaucrat guys are writing poems, great off. But if you think it's some, it's kind of going back to the same theory, right? But it's just sort of a credibility.
It's an ethical argument. It's that ethos part of the rhetorical triangle. You need to trust where the message is coming from, and you don't want to hear it preached down at you. It needs to come from your level. It needs to come from a peer. And I think that's maybe one of the big reasons. And not only that, but these noblemen, they're supposed to be doing other stuff. They're not supposed to be sitting down writing plays all the time and maybe making money off of it. And if not making money off of it, even more so, why are they doing it? You just maybe mistrust it. And so
it's definitely our paranoia,
right,
showing us maybe,
right. And I mean, to be fair, I don't really go too hard into the why question, because why do rappers not use their regular names? Why is Travis Scott not Jock Webster? Why is Bon Jovi not a real name. Like, why do these people do that? Like, why is Lewis Carroll Lewis Carroll? And there's a million answers for all these things, and it's not always an explicable answer. And like at some point, like it's part of the artistry itself. Though that said, like I don't want to wash away that question completely. Because I do think that there's probably a good reason why in this case, but
for sure you'll get that answer, as you turn the stones over.
Right. But at some point, there's like, I think a lot of people ask the question why to be like, there's no real good reason why. And like for me, there's a ton of good reasons why people would use a pseudonym, and so I just don't think that framing it as like, give me one good reason is a very good way to frame it, because there's plenty of reasons. But like, what's interesting about these models is that like some of these models don't really have an answer for pseudonymity. Like as much as I love Stotzenberg like doesn't like have a good answer for why. Like he says maybe market reasons, but like why is it more marketable to publish this all under one guy? Like why wouldn't Philip Sidney be marketable under Philip Sidney? He sold like hotcakes. Maybe we can get Francis Bacon doesn't want to put his noble name on this stuff, but honestly, Francis Bacon's not super big shot in the early 90s.
Maybe it goes back to the idea earlier, right, where people just buy the book if it says James Patterson, or if it says, Clive Cussler or whatever.
Right.
If it's got the name, then it's like, maybe this is a thing,
But like, why? How did that name even begin to be a name? Like, And so, like, Stotzenberg doesn't have much answer, and he doesn't really try to answer it easily. He tells you straight up, like, I'm not really going to go for that. And Stephanie Hopkins Hughes, she, attempts to answer it, but she'll say that everyone's sort of got a different reason. Bastian Conrad, that's one of his big things, is he desperately tries to answer that question. He thinks it's a survival thing. It's a life or death. Like, there's no other reason why you would need pseudonymity. You just put your name on it, but if you're supposed to be dead, you can't put your name on it. Let's see. But like, and then Alexander Waugh. This is one of my big problems with the Oxfordians. They'll say that De Vere had to do it because evil Robert Cecil, but then they'll also say that De Vere wanted to do it because that's this kind of noble Renaissance idea is that the thing itself needs to be bigger than you. Like you selflessly don't put your name on it, and you let the texts be itself, almost like it's directly from the
Dark Knight shit right there.
Yeah, like directly from the muses. Like that's from Shakespeare. That's from Athena herself. That's not from me. I'm just a conduit. And so I find that a little wishy-washy. Like, which is it? If it's both of those things, it seems highly coincidental that two opposing things have the same goal. Like, if Robert Cecil hates De Vere and hates Shakespeare and is trying to get his name smushed out, it seems like he's doing exactly what De Vere wanted if De Vere didn't want his name on it. So, like, which is it?
Yeah, exactly.
I've never quite been cool with that, and I think that's why a lot of anti-Stratfordian or anti-Stratfordians have argument against the Oxfordians, because the Oxfordians don't have quite a great answer for the pseudonymity. And so we're hoping that we can at some point, if not yet, have a better answer for that. And I think already we've at least put that in the foundation of our theory, that this is a state-run propagandic effort, if not a state-run, then a privately, closely, quasi-state-run effort. And because of what it is, like, you cannot put your name on it. You're trying to trick people into something, so you got to put somebody else's name on it. You're not going to say your own name, I'm tricking you and this is my name. In fact, they'll know that you're trying to trick them if you put your name on it. You got to put somebody else's name on it so they don't suspect being tricked. So that's kind of where we're going to start out with that. But this will change a bunch as we go on. Maybe not updated every video, but this will be subject to immense amount of change, and so it's another difference between ours and these.
Yeah, ours is still like a working, evolving.
These aren't going to change. These are what these people believe. Like, especially these two, they've been dead for like a century, but and some of these people are getting old, but like there's nothing that Jonah Freeman's going to change about his theory. He thinks Bacon wrote all these folks, and that yeah, it culminated in Shakespeare. Like, Donna Murphy's maybe going to find another little thing that she can tie in, but it's not going to change too much from Marlowe and Nash and maybe a few others wrote Shakespeare. Wallace Theory is not going to change too much. He might add one of these names down here, or he might put a name from up here to up here, but it's not going to change too much. I'm going to tell you right now, the only thing that's going to change on Bastion is just adding more names to who Marlowe wrote. So, like,
Shakespeare went back in time, wrote Chance and wrote Chaucer.
I don't know that any of these theories are, like, alive in that sense. There's, like, not much room for a dialectic. They think what they think, and that's it. And if they don't convince you, then they don't convince you. And every one of them sort of pitching it like, here's my theory against yours. And maybe I need to qualify that. The John Florio channel, she's super open to pretty much anything, and hers is constantly changing. I've probably oversimplified hers, and hers may actually look a whole lot more like ours. So I do need to qualify that a little bit.
But yeah, there could be some contention on John Florio, right? Because I think that we might,
and that's
just
one
as
that's
far
like
as,
Marlowe
us trying to
that
be
like
super honest about what we know about these people.
Right, and Florio's one that's super difficult for me. Like Marlowe, should he be on this side or should he be on this side? I'm so like up in the air on Florio that I like try and just not put him on the list till I know more. So I gotta go way deeper on Florio biography, because you can read all the Florio you want, but until you read actual biography on Florio,
once again, he's still connected.
It's just a
he's
hand.
still running in these same circles as all these people too, right?
Yeah,
So,
supposedly Florio's dad tutored some of these folks, and Florio would have grown up with these folks and gone to school with these folks. So, completely possible Florio's should be over here somewhere.
we'll let that chip fall when we kind of actually dive into it, right? This is still just sort of our laying out our thoughts and just showing our own sort of evolution of like how we kind of came to this idea. Is why do we think this is more parsimonious than any of the other ones? Why did this one feel more comprehensive, more compatible,
Right.
not just reality, but just with all the other theories put forward
Right.
up to this point,
And maybe something that I should have brought up a little more when I'm pitching my group theory is that, like, some point, very few of these theories can explicate Sir Thomas More manuscript. Very few of these can explicate why the Henslow Diary looks the way that it does. And there's other stuff, too, that they can't explicate. And it's mostly like, why do we have so many names? And, like, why do we have such evidence of collaboration, but then all these theories want to pitch, one or just two guys as the writers? And so, like, Sir Thomas More manuscript, I see Oxfordians try and avoid that like the plague. They just want to say that's got nothing to do with Shakespeare. Those are just some random other guys. Has nothing to do with Shakespeare. Because if they admit that that's Shakespeare, then they have to say where Oxford is in the Sir Thomas More manuscript, and all of a sudden that's just Oxford collaborating with 5 other guys. And to boot, Oxford's handwriting's not in Sir Thomas More, so he would have had to have some amanuensis or something. And beyond that, you have to say which of the guys Oxford is. And so, yeah, you can give him Hand D, which is supposed to be the great writer in Sir Thomas More, but Handy also had no clue what was happening in the play and just kind of, spat out some lines, albeit were really powerful, but didn't make sense with the rest of the play. And so it's like, you can say, okay, Oxford's the great writer, but if you say that, you're also saying Oxford didn't really have much understanding of the rest of the play, and it goes against that whole scriptorum argument. And so it's like, okay, Oxford must have just been the overseer of it, and these were all his underlings kind of doing it. But here's the thing, is that, like, Sir Thomas More is probably what most Shakespeare plays are, is a collaborative grouping of a random set of these people. And so, like, there are lines in Macbeth that read like Hand D, but there's also lines in Macbeth that read like Hand C and Hand E. And there's lines in, Julius Caesar that read like Hand A and Hand B, and there's lines in another one that read like hands that aren't in Sir Thomas More. And so we're going to go more and more and more into this group theory. We want to sort of dive into each of these candidates to some extent, and we want to dive into each of these writers that we think need to have more biography attached to them. Like, who is John Webster? What's he writing? What are the plays of Thomas Haywood? How good is George Chapman? Is Thomas Dekker the best thing since sliced bread? Like, these are all questions that we need to kind of answer. And so we'll be talking about that. Hopefully next time we come back, we want to actually dive in and just talk about one play in specific, and we're going to hopefully start a series of that. So the first one we want to talk about is Jew of Malta. We decided to pick one of the early University Wits plays, and I don't know, Jew of Malta is probably just my favorite of the Marlowe plays. And so I thought we'd start there and then go with from there to other plays that are, we think, maybe are on par with some of the Shakespeare greats, and say, look, it's not just Shakespeare. These are other plays worth considering, and not just worth considering on a literary level, but worth considering in this authorship question. So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully,
I wanted to do one.
Yeah.
Because we were still talking about. We were talking about the history of like how he got here, and there's one of the names. Well, two names here, and we'll zoom into the wall part. Because so remember we were talking about how we even got into this. So like Brady am not a English major at all, right? But I said earlier that I've been writing on this like novel forever. But my book, my character is English, right? And at one point, I just I was kind of currently reading Macbeth as I was writing it, so I was like, I'll just made him kind of quote Macbeth or whatever, right? So I quoted the incarnadine, the multitudinous sea or whatever at the beginning.
Turning the green one red.
And so and that got me down a rabbit hole of like, when did the actual history, or what's the actual history of teaching Shakespeare in the classroom or whatever, right? So I was kind of got onto that, and then I went over to your house, and this is when I think you were already on the second Shakespeare kick, and you were kind of like starting to kind of like piece in, like being like, yeah, I think there's multiple like weird authorship. I think you were starting to get post De Vere at this point, right? 'Cause I think you'd already informed me a lot about De Vere, and you pulled out your Shakespeare or your Macbeth copy, and it was the Signet Classic. That you can pretty much get it. And so you even opened it up, and you're like, dude, look at the introduction. They cannot help but talk about some of the Shakespeare authorship question stuff, or the Shakespeare authorship doubting, right? So even some of these mainstream books,
if any of you guys ever pick up the Signet Classics with the white covers and the gold stripes, they're great. Shakespeare paperback copies, cheap, got good intros, all that kind of stuff.
So I remember you picked me up and showed me this book, and like right in there in the intro. And I had never seen like any of these names. I'd heard De Vere, of course, right? But I've made Marlowe. But pretty much anybody else, like I didn't know any, like none of the other names. But right here, it's talking about Robert Greene, reference to apparently to Shakespeare, whatever, right? And so you're talking about Robert Greene, but that was already triggering. And this is definitely my own personal biography. But as I am very much interested in like a synchronicity sort of detective work, right? So I am definitely in woo-woo land when it comes to anything like that. So he's already showed me this thing about even like the mainstream books about how they're trying so hard to show like Shakespeare Stratford's the real guy, right? And I pointed out, oh look, Greene, that's an interesting name, because you and I have you specifically even have more connection with the colored green, right? Because even as we're sitting right now, you're wearing your super
I always wear a green hat. I got green
always
eyes.
Green.
My favorite guitarist is Peter Green.
Yep, exactly, right. So Peter Green, of course. We're gonna do that maybe somewhere down the line too. But the colored green had come up, and multiple other lines of research that kept kind of like reoccurring itself. So I became very interested in it, and I was kind of like I was already thinking about my book and my character, and I was like, I kind of wanted to look into this. So I go. That day, I went into Google and typed in like Shakespeare Robert Greene, and literally the first things that popped up was something about this guy named Thomas Nash, and of course my synchronicity, sonar was going wild because my name is Brady, my last name is Nash, and my middle name is actually Thomas.
So it was Brady's name is Brady Thomas Nash.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, oh my god. So Thomas is my grandfather's name and my uncle's name.
He did not know that was his namesake.
Yeah, so I was like, at that point I was like, all right, well the Shakespeare authorship question is calling me. I haven't done nearly as much of the footwork as groundwork as Chance has done, right? But I provide the the rebound or board for ideas.
Voice of reason.
Yeah. Or maybe voice of insanity. Sometimes will definitely egg you on. Is like yes, let's go even further down the more outlandish theory.
Right. And so like maybe we don't always all get that personal of a connection, but like pretty much everybody can do this. You can find your own little personal connection to Shakespeare, to the works of Shakespeare, to this authorship question, and like it gets deeper every time you find these new names. And so Brady had heard De Vere, he had heard Bacon, he'd heard Marlowe, and then he came across this Green name and thought, oh wow, this is a whole new name. But coming across that name led to another name, and then that kind of blew his mind because it's basically his own name. But from there you realize there's a whole set of names. And here, let me scroll up to our chart. These are all guys that may not be real dudes. And so we got a bunch of names that we need to go and look at. And the fun thing about looking
to read too.
Yeah, I was going to say the fun thing is that these guys are all on par with Shakespeare. So you get to read. Everybody always what if we could find a missing Shakespeare? It's have you read all of these guys yet? You don't need to find a missing Shakespeare. There's 500 plays you can go read, and when you finish that, then go complain about not having enough Shakespeare.
And then to bring it back to some of that great writing, and you just told me about this earlier, or finished out this other crazy fact. But just before we got into super Shakespeare authorship, right? We were talking about just our history of reading, and we both got into reading a lot of those old, pulp crime novels and whatnot.
Yeah,
right?
hard-boiled detective.
Yeah, we got into the Raymond Chandler and the Ross MacDonald and the Dashiell Hammett. But of course, I only read one Chandler book, but you got much more familiar with Philip Marlowe, right? But yeah, looking back, and I think you were already into the Shakespeare authorship question, but you pointed that out, Philip Sidney. And then you also got obviously Christopher Marlowe, right? But then tonight you were just telling me earlier that not only that, obviously, but the connection between these two, Shakespeare sphere names, right? We get as a combination name, but you said that Philip Marlowe has what in his apartment at all times?
Yeah, whatever? Philip Marlowe, there's not much stuff in Philip Marlowe's apartment, but one of the things he has is a chess set, and then he has a handbook of all the past championship chess games. But then the other thing he's got next to his nightstand is a copy of the Shakespeare Folio.
Dun, dun, dun.
And so,
that blew my mind. I was oh, God.
Raymond Chandler knew his Shakespeare.
And that's what we're talking about, yeah.
Not just his Shakespeare. He knew his Sidney. He knew his Marlowe. He knew his Renaissance era.
And I don't want to be a schmuck. I want to be, someone who gets, remembered. Obviously, it seems like, that's what we're talking about, paying due diligence as far as to the craft itself,
right?
And maybe we've gotten stuck.
And shout out to Raymond Chandler because he didn't start publishing until his 40s or 50s, and so most of Raymond Chandler's novels are written in his 40s, 50s, and 60s. So
he just cracked the Shakespeare authorship question, and then he just started hiding, and then he started writing detective fiction.
Right,
see? It's all there.
And so that's the life path set up for us, and hopefully that'll get us there. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, guys. Please comment. Please like and subscribe if you do want to keep staying involved with this discussion.
Yeah, drop your contentious theories. Tell us why Stratford's the real man, and we'll put you in your place or whatever.
or just tell me what you would like to see. If you are someone that has contention with Shakespeare authorship question, maybe this Shakespeare authorship question won't go away, but tell us what you'd like to see coming out of it. If this won't go away, at least what's something good that could come out of it? Or any folks that have your guy or your lady, voice why you think it's them. Or if you think it's not somebody, it can't be Bacon because of blah blah, tell me why. Because you may know something that I don't, and even if you don't, you may have an interesting sort of viewpoint. And our whole thing with this collective authorship is not just collective authorship; it's collective investigation of that authorship. We need more eyes and ears on this question, and so the more the merrier. the more we talk about this, the more we can get down to brass tacks. It's a dialectic, not a debate. So let's do that moving forward. Just let us know.
Yes, the more the merry wives of Windsor, right?
But you guys enjoy your Novembers and your upcoming Decembers, and hopefully we will have some more content posted for you very soon. And like I said, one of these days we'll have some more edited type stuff, and not just the podcast setup, but still working through that. Give us a little time. All right, y'all take it easy, and we will be talking with y'all soon.
Adios, y'all.